I had been on the trail for 2 days when the rain came in harder than the forecast had promised. I was deep in the cranberry wilderness in West Virginia, in a stretch of backcountry where the trail markers had been faded by enough seasons that I had been relying on my map and the small intuitions a person develops after enough nights alone in the woods. The forecast had called for showers in the afternoon and clearing by evening. The rain had started around 3 and had not let up since. By 5:30, the light was already failing under the canopy, the gray of an overcast late afternoon, going to the deeper gray of dusk. And I had begun to look for a place to camp. I was in good shape for the weather. I had a good rain jacket and a good pack cover and a tent that had held up in worse. What I wanted was a flat spot off the trail, screened from the wind, somewhere I could get the tent up before the last of the light went. The country in that part of the wilderness rolls in a way that does not give you many flat spots. The ridges come up steep on either side of small narrow drainages, and the trail follows the drainages mostly, and a flat place to lay out a tent is something you have to look for. I had noticed on the map that there was a clearing maybe half a mile ahead, marked with the small symbol that indicates a recognized camping area, the kind of place backcountry hikers had used enough times that the Forest Service had let the use stand. I pushed on toward it. I came up over a small rise in the trail and I stopped. The clearing was below me, maybe 40 yards, down a gentle slope through the trees. I could see it well enough in the failing gray light. The clearing was the kind of place I had been hoping for, a flat patch of ground, maybe 30 feet across, screened by hemlocks on 3 sides, with a small creek running along the far edge. The kind of place a person picks for a tent without even thinking about it, and there was already a tent in it. It was an old canvas tent, the dark green kind that hunters used in the 70s and 80s, the kind with the steep A-frame ridge, and the canvas that goes almost black when it is wet. It was set up with a precision that I noticed even from up on the rise. The lines were taut. The ridgepole was level. The canvas was pulled tight enough that the rain was running off it in clean sheets, the way water runs off a tent that has been pitched by someone who knows what they are doing. There was no fire. The fire ring at the center of the clearing was wet and cold. There were no boots set out by the flap of the tent. There was no pack leaning against a tree. There was no clothesline. There was no sign that anyone had set up house in that clearing at all, other than the tent itself. I stood up on the rise for a long time, looking down at it. The rain was running off the brim of my hood in a steady stream. I called out. I cupped my hand around my mouth, and I called hello, the way you call hello in the woods when you do not want to startle someone who might be sleeping. There was no answer. I waited, and I called again. The rain kept falling. The tent did not move. Nothing in the clearing moved. I should have walked on. That is the part I have thought about most in the years since. I should have turned around on the rise and walked back the way I had come, looked at my map again, found a different flat spot somewhere off trail, made my own clearing in the woods if I had to. There were any number of small, reasonable choices I could have made. I did not make any of them. I was tired and I was wet, and the light was almost gone. And I told myself that whoever had set up the tent must have walked off for water or for firewood and would be back soon, and that I could set up my own tent at the far edge of the clearing in the trees, and we would meet in the morning, like 2 backcountry strangers, and exchange a nod and go our separate ways. I have told myself that explanation many times. It does not hold up to even gentle examination. Backcountry hikers do not leave their packs out of their tents in the rain. They do not leave their boots inside. They do not walk away from a pitched tent in failing light, with no light source visible anywhere in the clearing. But that is what I told myself, and I walked down the slope into the clearing, and I picked a spot 50 yards across the clearing, under the hemlocks, and I set up my tent. I did not approach the green tent. I want to make that clear. I did not call out again from the bottom of the slope. I did not knock on the canvas the way a person might knock on a door. I set up my own tent with my back turned, and I worked quickly because the light was going, and when I was done I crawled inside, and I changed into dry clothes, and I ate cold supper from a bag, and I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain on the rainfly. The rain did not let up. It got harder, if anything. The sound of it on the fly was loud enough that I could not have heard much else, even if there had been something to hear. There was no sound from the green tent, no light, no movement of the canvas, no voice. Through the mesh of my tent door, I could see the shape of it across the clearing, a darker shape in the deep dark of the wet woods. I lay in my bag for a long time looking at it, and at some point I fell asleep. I do not know what time I woke. It was deep night, the kind of dark you only get under the canopy in country, where there are no roads and no towns for many miles. I came up out of sleep slowly, with the awareness that something had brought me to the surface, the way the brain wakes you when it has registered a sound that is not the sound of the rain. I lay very still. I kept my eyes closed for a long moment. I listened. The rain was still falling. It had eased a little. The sound on the rainfly was softer now, the steady patter of a rain that has been going for hours and will go for hours more. I listened past it. I listened for whatever had woken me. For a long time I heard nothing. I had almost convinced myself I had dreamed it. And then I heard the sound, and I knew exactly what it was, and I went cold in the bag. It was the sound of a tent flap being unzipped. I had heard that sound many times in my life. There is no other sound like it. The slow, steady click, click, click of a zipper being drawn carefully through its track. The small high note of plastic on plastic. The soft sound of canvas or nylon parting as the zipper moves. The sound I heard was that sound, but it was being done very slowly. The zipper was being drawn 1 or 2 teeth at a time, with long pauses between each small movement, the way a person unzips a flap when they are trying not to wake another person in the tent with them. The pauses were uneven. The whole unzipping was patient. It went on and on and on. The sound was coming from the direction of the green tent. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes open in the dark, and I did not move. I did not breathe deeply. I kept my breathing as quiet as I could make it. I listened to the slow, careful unzipping go on across the clearing. It must have taken almost a full minute. There was a long flap on those old canvas tents, the kind that ran the full height of the A-frame doorway, and whoever was unzipping it was doing it inch by inch, with a patience that was its own statement. I could picture the hand on the zipper. I could picture the deliberation. I could not picture the face above the hand, and I did not want to. The unzipping stopped. The rain kept falling. I could hear it on the rain fly above me. I could hear nothing else. I lay there in the dark, and I waited. I waited for the sound of someone stepping out of the tent. I waited for the sound of feet on the wet leaves. I waited for the sound of the unzipping to resume, for the flap to go all the way open. None of those things happened. The unzipping had stopped at some point, part-way through, before the flap was fully open, and then nothing had happened. The tent across the clearing was as silent as it had been all evening. But now it was silent, with the flap partially unzipped. Whoever had been working at the zipper had stopped, and they had not come out. And they had not gone back to sleep, because a person who is going back to sleep does not stop unzipping a flap halfway through. They had stopped. I came to understand as I lay there in the dark, because they had heard something. They had heard a sound from outside their tent, and they had stopped what they were doing in order to listen. I lay completely still. I did not turn my head. I did not roll over. I kept my breathing slow and shallow. I do not know how long I lay there. The dark of the tent was the same dark, all the way to the canvas walls. I could not see anything across the clearing. I could only listen. I did not hear any further sound from the green tent, not for the rest of the night. Not a footstep, not a movement, not a continuation of the unzipping. The flap, I understood, was still partially open. I understood this for the rest of the night, even though I could not see it. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes open in the dark, and I listened to the rain, and I did not sleep. The sky began to lighten around 5:30. I could see the gray of dawn through the rainfly. I lay still for a long time after I could see. I did not want to move until I could see well enough through the mesh of my tent door to see whatever was in the clearing. The dark in the woods does not give way easily under a heavy canopy in the rain. It took until almost 6 before I could make out the shapes of the trees on the far side. I sat up in my sleeping bag, and I turned slowly toward the door of my tent, and I looked across the clearing. The green tent was gone. I want to be careful about this part. I sat in my sleeping bag, and I stared across the clearing for a long time, because I could not understand what I was seeing. The tent was not packed up at the edge of the clearing. The tent was not somewhere in the trees. The tent was gone. The fire ring at the center of the clearing was still there. The flat patch of ground where the tent had stood was still there. But there was no tent on it. There were no stakes in the ground. There were no marks in the leaves where the canvas had been pulled taut. There was nothing. I got out of my sleeping bag. I put on my boots in my tent because the ground outside was a mess of wet leaves and mud. I crawled out, and I stood up and I walked across the clearing in the gray light of dawn. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour. The woods were dripping. I came to the spot where the green tent had been pitched. I walked all around it. I looked at the leaves on the ground. I looked at the small, flat indentations in the wet earth where the rocks would have anchored the corners of the tent. There were no indentations. There was no flattened patch where a tent floor had been. The leaves were as undisturbed as the leaves anywhere else in the clearing. There was no sign that a tent had been pitched there at all. I do not know how to explain that, and I have not tried very hard because the explanations I have considered are worse than not knowing. A canvas A-frame tent of the kind I had seen does not pack up silently. It does not break down in the rain and the dark without a person making noise. I had been awake from 2 in the morning until first light. I had heard nothing across the clearing other than the unzipping. I do not know how the tent left. I do not know whether it had ever been there, or whether I had been the only person who had seen it, or whether someone had been inside it all along and had been waiting for me to fall asleep again. The way a person waits, with a hand on a zipper, for the right kind of stillness. I packed up that morning faster than I have ever packed up a camp. I did not make coffee. I rolled my tent wet and stuffed it into the pack, and I hiked out the way I had come in, even though it was a longer route to the trailhead than going forward would have been. I have not been back to the Cranberry Wilderness. I have done some backcountry camping in the years since, but never alone, and never in country I have not seen in daylight first. I think sometimes about the unzipping. I think about how patient it was. I think about how it had stopped halfway through. I think about what had been on the other side of the canvas in those last seconds before whoever was working at the zipper decided not to come out. And I think about how, in the dark of my own tent, I had been the sound they had stopped to listen for, and I have wondered every night for a long time what would have happened if I had moved. I had been planning the trip for almost a year. I worked a corporate job in Charlotte that drained the kind of attention out of me that only solitude in the woods seemed to give back, and I had circled a week in October on my calendar in red the previous winter, the way you circle dates that have to happen for you to remain a person. I had picked the Pisgah National Forest because I had hiked sections of it on weekends and had always wanted to do a longer trip there, into the parts of the forest where the trails get smaller and the people get fewer. I had spent months on the map. I had picked a loop that would take me 5 days, with 3 nights of true backcountry camping, in places where I would not see another soul. I had told my brother where I was going. I had told no one else. I had given my brother a copy of the route and the dates I would be back. And that was the only person in the world who knew where I would be. I drove up on a Friday afternoon at the end of the second week of October. The leaves were just past their peak in the high country. The maples already mostly dropped, the oaks holding on. The air had the particular thin, clean sharpness of a southern Appalachian fall. And the parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty when I pulled in. I locked the car and I shouldered my pack. And I walked up the trail into the woods with the kind of small lifting in the chest that I had been waiting for since the previous winter. The first day was as good as the first day of a trip can be. I made good time. I camped at a small site by a creek that I had picked off the map, and I watched the light go down through the trees. And I went to bed early, and I slept well. The second day was the day the weather started to turn. The forecast had said scattered showers in the afternoon and clearing overnight. The forecast had been wrong. The showers came in around 2, and they did not scatter. They settled in. The slow, steady mountain rain that the southern Appalachians get in the fall, the kind that does not have any drama in it, just the patient, unrelenting rain of a system that has decided to sit on a ridge for a few days. I put on my rain jacket, and I kept walking. I made it to the next site I had picked on the map, a small flat clearing, about a mile off the main trail in a section of forest that I had specifically chosen because the map showed no other camping areas anywhere near it. I wanted the quiet. I had picked this site for the quiet. I set up my tent in the rain. I cooked supper under a small tarp I had rigged off the ridgepole. I crawled into the tent at 7 because there was nothing to do outside. And the light was already failing under the cloud cover, and I read on my phone with the brightness turned down low until I was tired enough to sleep. I do not know what time I first started to drift. I remember setting the phone down and pulling the bag up around my shoulders and listening to the rain on the rain fly. It was a good sound. It was the sound I had been waiting all year to hear. I went under fast. I came back up out of sleep slowly. The way you come up when something has registered at the edge of your hearing that does not belong. I lay very still in the dark of the tent with my eyes open, and I did not move. The rain was still falling. The fly above me was a steady, soft drumming. I listened past it. For a long moment I did not hear anything else, and I almost convinced myself that I had dreamed whatever had woken me, and I started to relax back into the bag. Then I heard the voice. It was a man's voice. It was coming from somewhere out in the trees, far enough away that the rain on the fly almost covered it, close enough that I could make out the word. The word was my name, my full first name. The voice was not shouting. It was the conversational call you use when you are looking for a friend you think might be just out of sight. That warm, carrying pitch you use when you are not worried, just trying to get someone's attention. The voice called my name once, paused, and then was silent. I lay completely still. I did not move my arms. I did not turn my head. I kept my breathing slow and shallow, I thought, in the first long moment after the voice came, that I had imagined it, that I had been deeper in sleep than I had thought and had dreamed the sound. The mind plays tricks in the woods at night. I had been camping alone enough times to know that. I tried to make myself believe it had been a dream. Then the voice came again. It was closer this time. Not by a large amount, maybe 10 yards closer than the first call. But it was clearly closer, and it was coming from a different direction. The first call had been from somewhere off to my left, up the slope. This second call was from in front of the tent, from somewhere across the small flat clearing in the trees on the far side. The voice used my name again, in the same warm conversational tone, and then it added a sentence. It asked me, in a voice that sounded perfectly reasonable, if I had forgotten the way back to the car. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I did not move. I felt the cold that comes into the body when the body has understood something the mind is still working through. The voice was a stranger's voice. It was not a voice I had ever heard before. It was not the voice of anyone I had passed on the trail. I had passed 3 people in 2 days, an older couple on the first afternoon, and a man in his 50s on the second morning. None of them had voices that sounded like this. This voice was lower. It was steady. It had the particular even pitch of a person who is not in any hurry. And it had used my full first name, which I had not given to anyone on the trail. I had nodded at the older couple. I had said good morning to the man on the second morning. I had not introduced myself to anyone. I had not stopped to talk to anyone for longer than the time it took to pass on the trail. There was no one in those woods who should have known what my name was, and there was no one in those woods who should have known that I had a car at a trailhead. I do not have the words for what I felt then. It was not the kind of fear that makes you move. It was the kind of fear that makes you not move. I lay in the tent, and I did not move a muscle, and I listened. The voice came again. From the right this time. From somewhere down the slope, maybe 20 yards off. Still calling my name. Still in that same warm conversational tone. Still patient. The voice had moved. The voice was walking. It was not running. It was not crashing through the underbrush. It was moving at the pace of a person who is on a casual walk through the woods, the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going and have no need to hurry. The voice was circling the tent. I do not know how long I lay there. The voice kept calling. It came from every direction over the next hour. From up the slope, from down the slope, from in front, from behind. Always staying just inside the tree line at the edge of the clearing, never coming into the open. Always at the same patient walking pace. Always using my name, sometimes adding a sentence. Once it asked if I needed any help finding the trail. Once it asked if I was hurt. Once it told me, almost gently, that I was a long way out, and that it was no kind of weather to be alone in. The voice was never distressed. The voice was never urgent. The voice was the voice of a person who had all the time in the world. The rain kept falling. I lay in the bag with my eyes open, and I listened to the voice circle me, and I made myself breathe through my nose as quietly as I could, and I kept my hands flat at my sides, and I did not move. I did not call back. I did not turn on my headlamp. I did not reach for my knife, which was in the side pocket of my pack at the foot of the tent, because I knew that I did not want the voice outside to hear me moving. I had begun to understand, in some part of my mind that had not been alive in me before that night, that the voice was waiting for a response. Any response. That the voice had been calling out the things it had been calling out, because it was hoping I would say something back that. The voice was working through possibilities. trying to find the one I would answer. The voice kept this up for what I think was almost an hour. I did not have a watch on. My phone was in the small pocket inside the tent, and I did not want to reach for it. I counted slowly to 100 over and over, and I lost count many times, and the voice kept calling. It went around the clearing in slow, patient circles, always staying just inside the trees, and it never once came into the open, and it never once tried the tent. I do not know what it would have done if I had answered. I do not know what it would have done if I had unzipped the flap, even slightly. I do not know what it would have done if I had moved. I know only that I did not, and that at some point, with no transition I can name, the voice stopped. It did not move farther away and grow fainter. It did not say a last word and walk off into the woods. It was speaking, and then it would not. The clearing went back to the sound of the rain. I waited for the voice to start again. It did not. I waited a long time. The rain kept falling. The dark of the tent stayed dark. I do not know when I started to believe the voice was actually gone. I do not know if I ever fully believed it. I lay in the bag with my eyes open until the canvas of the tent began to lighten with the first gray of dawn, and even then I did not move. When the light was strong enough that I could see the inside of the tent clearly, I sat up. I sat very slowly. I did not unzip the flap right away. I sat in the bag and I listened for a long time, and the woods were quiet, only the rain and the dripping of the trees. I unzipped the flap with my hands as steady as I could make them, and I looked out into the clearing. There was no one there. The clearing was empty. The rain was still falling. The leaves on the ground were the dark, wet brown of late October. I could see no footprints. The ground was the kind of leaf-covered earth that does not take prints well. I could see no sign of anyone at all. I packed up. I packed faster than I have ever packed up a camp. I rolled the tent wet, and I jammed it into the pack, and I shouldered the pack, and I walked out of the clearing into the rain. I did not go back the way I had come in. I had come in on a small spur trail off the main loop. I went out a different way, on a different spur, that I had identified the day before as a backup option, because I did not want to walk back along any path the voice might have learned. I do not know if that decision made any difference. I do not know if the voice had known the trail I had come in on. I do not know what the voice had been planning if I had answered. I know only that I did not want to retrace any step I had already taken, because the voice had known my name, and the voice had known about the car. And those were two things the voice should not have known. And I could not bear to walk back through any country where the voice had already been. I made it to the trailhead a few hours later. The parking lot was almost empty. My car was where I had left it. I checked the windows and the doors and the underside of the car before I got in. I drove home that afternoon, 6 hours, without stopping for anything except gas. I called my brother from the road, and I told him I was on my way back early. I did not tell him why. I have never told him why. I have told no one why, except in the way I am telling it now, which is not quite the same as telling a person. I have not been backcountry camping alone since that trip. I have done some camping with friends, in places where there are other tents in sight. I do not pitch alone anymore. I think about the voice sometimes. I think about the warm conversational pitch of it. I think about how patient it was. I think about how it knew my name. And I have wondered, in the years since, how it had come to know it, and what it would have called me by if it had been waiting in those woods for someone else. I had been planning the trip since the previous spring, when I had taken a long weekend in the southern stretch of the Monongahela, and had decided on the second day of that trip that I wanted to come back and spend a longer stretch in the country up north, where the forest gets thicker, and the ridges run closer together, and the trails turn into something you have to work to follow. I lived in Pittsburgh then, and I worked a desk job that gave me 4 weeks of vacation a year that I had taken to spending in increments of a few days at a time in the high country of West Virginia, alone, with my own pack and my own tent and my own quiet. I had picked a section of the national forest on the map, where there were almost no marked trails and where the contour lines stacked up close enough that I knew I would not see another person. For the 3 days I had planned to be out, I had told my sister where I was going. I had given her the dates I would be back. I had driven down on a Thursday afternoon in early October, the leaves not yet turning hard, but the air sharp enough that I had been glad of the jacket I had packed. The country up there is the kind of country that does not give you much to work with for a campsite. The ridges are steep on both sides, and the small hollows between them are too wet to lie down in, with creeks and seeps everywhere, and the only flat ground is on the very tops of the ridges themselves, in the small openings where the spruce thins out and lets a person see for a few yards in any direction. I had been looking for a spot like that for most of the second day, and I had found one in the middle of the afternoon. A small, flat shelf on the top of a ridge, with a clear view through a break in the trees to the next ridge across a narrow hollow. The opposite ridge was maybe a quarter of a mile away across the gap. The hollow between them ran north and south, and from where I stood, I could see most of the spine of the next ridge over, the dark spruce, the bare patches of rock, the slow rising line of the ridgetop against the sky. It was the kind of view that justifies the climb to get to it. I set up my tent with the door facing the opposite ridge because I wanted to be able to lie inside in the morning and look across the hollow with my coffee and feel like I had been given something for the work of being there. The rain came in just after dark. I had finished supper and packed away the stove, and I had crawled into the tent and gotten into my sleeping bag, and I had a small paperback in my hand and my headlamp on my forehead, and I was reading by the small cone of light it threw onto the pages. I could hear the rain on the rainfly. The mesh of the tent door was open behind the rainfly, which meant I could look out through the small, triangular gap and see a piece of the night beyond. It was the kind of dark you only get in country that is many miles from any electric light. The sky was overcast, and the trees were dripping, and the hollow below me was an inkwell. I read for maybe 10 minutes before I looked up. There was a light on the opposite ridge. It was small. It was the soft yellow color of an old lantern, the kind of warm round glow that a kerosene lantern or an old gas lantern gives off. It was bobbing gently the way a lantern bobs when it is being carried. I would have thought nothing of it. Backcountry hikers carry lanterns sometimes, and the country was not technically closed to other campers, and another person being on the opposite ridge was not, in itself, anything strange. I had not seen anyone in 2 days, which was unusual, but not impossible. I looked at the light for a moment, and I went back to my book. After a few minutes, I looked up again. The light was still there. It was still bobbing. I noticed that it had moved a little. It had been roughly in the center of my view, through the gap in the trees the first time I had looked, and now it was a small distance to the right, the way a light might move if a person was walking slowly along the spine of the ridge. I watched it for a moment. It moved a little more. The bobbing was steady. The walking was unhurried. I went back to my book. The third time I looked up, I do not know how much later, the light had moved farther to the right. It was still bobbing in the same gentle way. The person carrying it was making good slow progress along the ridgeline. I noticed this time that the bobbing was extraordinarily regular. The light went up a small amount and then down the same small amount, in the same rhythm, with the same distance between rise and fall, with a metronome's precision. I did not put it down for very long, but the thought entered my head. I had been carrying a lantern for many years of backcountry trips, and I had carried other people's lanterns, and a lantern in a hand does not bob like a metronome. It catches on things. The hand drops to grip something on a slope. The light dips when the person stoops. The light steadies briefly when the person stops to look at something. The bobbing of a real lantern in a real hand has a kind of human messiness to it. This light did not. This light was moving as if it had been mounted on a slow, steady arm that was rising and falling at a fixed amplitude. I set the book down on my chest. I watched the light. I watched it move along the ridge. I watched it for several minutes. The bobbing did not change. The pace did not change. The height of the bobbing did not change. The person carrying the lantern, if there was a person carrying the lantern, was not stepping over fallen logs. They were not navigating around the rocks and the spruce on the spine of the ridge, which I knew were there, because I had been on similar ridges, and I knew what the ground looked like. They were not climbing the small rises and descending the small dips that any real ridge has, even when it looks level from a distance. The light was moving in a perfectly horizontal line, at the same height above whatever was beneath it, at the same pace, with the same bobbing rhythm, in the rain, in the full dark, with no other light visible anywhere. I sat up in the tent. I turned off my headlamp. I want to say something about that. I have thought about that moment many times in the years since, and the decision to turn off my headlamp is the one I keep returning to. I had been reading by the small cone of light at the front of the tent, and from the opposite ridge, the light from my headlamp would have been clearly visible. A small yellow square of light on the dark ridgeline, the unmistakable signature of a person in a tent with a light source on, the way another camper's tent looks across a hollow at night. I had been advertising my presence, without knowing that I had been. When I turned the lamp off, the front of my tent went dark, and from the opposite ridge there would have been nothing to see. I do not know what made me turn it off. I think I wanted to see the light on the opposite ridge more clearly, the way you turn off your inside light at home to see something outside a window. I think I did not yet have a reason that I could name to want to hide myself, but I did turn it off, and I watched. For maybe 2 more minutes, the light continued to move along the ridge in the same steady bobbing rhythm, and then the light stopped. It did not slow down. It did not gradually come to a halt. The bobbing was happening, and then the bobbing was not. The light hung in the dark across the hollow, completely still. It did not flicker. It did not sway in the wind, even though there was wind enough on my ridge to be moving the spruce around the tent. It hung in the air at the same height it had been bobbing at, as if whatever had been holding it had stopped walking and had set the light down on something invisible. The light did not move for a long moment. Then it did not move for another long moment. The rain kept falling. The dark of the hollow between us was complete, except for that single small yellow point on the far ridgeline. I sat in my tent in the dark, and I looked at the light, and I felt the cold come into my chest that I had not felt before in any time I had spent alone in the woods. The light had stopped, I understood, because I had stopped. The person carrying the light, if there was a person, had been walking along the ridge with their lantern at a steady pace. Until the moment I had turned off my headlamp, and they had stopped walking the second I had stopped being visible. They had stopped because they had noticed. They had been watching me. The whole time, the light had been moving along the opposite ridge. The whole time, I had been watching the rhythm of its bobbing and thinking about the strangeness of the regularity. Whoever had been holding that light had been watching the small yellow square of my tent with the headlamp on inside it. And they had been moving along the ridge to keep a particular position, or to track a particular line of sight, or to do something I have not let myself think too hard about. And when the square of light had gone out, they had stopped. Because there was no longer anything to track. Because the work that had brought them to that ridge, in the rain, in the middle of the night, had been suspended. I did not move. I sat in the tent in the dark, and I watched the light on the opposite ridge for what I think was almost 2 hours. It did not move again. It did not go out. It did not flicker. It hung in the dark across the hollow with the same patient stillness that the headlights of a stopped car have on a long stretch of road. The rain kept falling. The wind moved the spruce around my tent and did not move the light at all. I sat with my knees drawn up against my chest and my hands flat on my knees, and I did not turn the headlamp back on, and I did not unzip the rain fly any further, and I did not look away from the light. I was afraid that if I looked away, the light would start to move again, and that this time it would move in a direction I did not want it to move. I do not know what time the light finally went out. I sat watching it until exhaustion did the thing exhaustion does, and at some point, I came awake with my chin against my chest and my legs cramped, and I looked across the hollow, and the opposite ridge was completely dark. I do not know if the light had gone out gradually or all at once. I do not know if the person who had been holding it had walked away. I do not know if the person had still been there in the dark across the hollow when I had fallen asleep, watching the front of my tent for the headlamp to come back on. I did not sleep again that night. I sat with my back against the rolled-up part of my pad, and I watched the opposite ridge through the mesh of the door until the canvas around me began to lighten with the gray of dawn. I broke camp at first light. I did not eat. I did not make coffee. I packed the tent wet, and I shouldered the pack, and I went out the way I had come in, off the spine of the ridge, down the trail I had taken up, watching the woods around me, the way you watch the woods, when you have decided that the trees can hide things you did not know they could hide. The opposite ridge was visible to me for the first half hour of the descent, through the breaks in the trees. I looked across at it more times than I want to admit. I never saw a light. I never saw a figure. I never saw any sign that anyone had ever been on the ridge across from mine. By the time I was on the lower trail, and the opposite ridge was no longer visible, I had begun to wonder if the light had ever been there at all. And then I had begun to wonder, more honestly, who had been there with it, and I had stopped letting myself look up. I drove home that afternoon. I have not gone back to the Monongahela. I have done some shorter trips in other forests in the years since, always with another person, always with a clear view of the trail in and the trail out, and I do not pitch a tent anymore on a ridge that looks across at another ridge. I think about the light sometimes, when I cannot sleep. I think about how level it had been. I think about how patient. I think about the moment it stopped and the long stillness after, and I have wondered, in the way you wonder things you cannot prove, what would have happened if I had turned the headlamp back on, and how long the light would have started moving again, and whether the bobbing this time would have been across the hollow, coming closer in the same steady metronome rhythm, with the same horizontal precision, in the rain and the dark, all the way to my ridge. My brother Caleb and I had been planning the trip for most of the spring. He was 4 years younger than me, and we had grown up camping together with our father in the Cherokee National Forest, and the trips had thinned out the way trips do once one brother goes to college, and then the other one does. And then they end up living in different cities with different jobs. He was in Knoxville, and I was in Asheville, and the drive between us was 3 hours. And we had decided in March that we were going to start doing one weekend trip together every spring, just the two of us, the way our father had done with his own brother for as long as we could remember. We had picked a small state forest in eastern Tennessee for the first of these trips. It was a forest neither of us had ever been to, which had been part of the point. A small parcel of public land tucked into the foothills, with one main trail looping a couple of ridges, a primitive backcountry campsite at the top of the loop, and almost no usage by hikers, because the forest was not on any of the well-known guides, and the access road was a long way from any interstate. We drove in on a Friday afternoon in mid-May. The rain had been on and off in eastern Tennessee for a week, the kind of soft, warm rain that the southern Appalachians get in late spring, and the forecast for the weekend was more of the same. We did not care. We had good rain gear and good tents, and we had agreed on the drive up that the rain would be the thing that kept everyone else off the trail, and we would have the country to ourselves. We parked at the small trailhead just before 3. There were no other cars in the lot. We shouldered our packs, and we started up the trail. The hike to the campsite at the top of the ridge was about 4 miles. It took us most of the afternoon. The country was beautiful in the soft gray light, the trees in their full new green, the trail running along a small creek for the first stretch, and then climbing in switchbacks up the side of the ridge. We did not pass anyone. We did not see any sign that anyone had been on the trail in the last few days. The mud held no prints other than our own as we climbed. We came up to the campsite in the late afternoon. It was a small, flat clearing on the top of the ridge, with a stone fire ring at the center, and enough flat ground to comfortably pitch 2 tents and not be on top of each other. We set up our tents about 10 feet apart, with the doors facing each other across the clearing, the way our father had always taught us to pitch, when there were 2 of us, so we could see each other from inside our tents if we needed to. We cooked supper under a small tarp that I had rigged off a low branch. The rain came in heavier as the light was failing, and by the time we had finished eating and cleaned up the small stove, it was the steady drumming rain of a system that had set in. We sat under the tarp for a while in the dark with our headlamps off, and we talked. We talked about our father, who had died 2 years before. We talked about old trips. We talked about a girl Caleb had been seeing in Knoxville, and a job change I had been thinking about, the kind of talk 2 brothers have when they have not had a chance to sit in the dark in the woods together for a long time. Around 11, we crawled into our separate tents. I called good night across the small space between us. He called good night back. I heard him zip up his tent flap. I zipped up mine. I lay in my sleeping bag in the dark with the rain on the rain fly. And I went to sleep within a few minutes, the way you sleep when you have been walking all day, and you are warm and dry, and the only thing left to do is rest. I do not know what time I woke. The kind of dark you get in a state forest in the rain in the middle of the night does not give you a sense of the hour without a clock, and I had set my phone face down on the floor of the tent, and I had not looked at it. I came up out of sleep slowly, with the awareness that something had brought me to the surface, the way the brain wakes you when it has registered a sound that does not belong in the small set of sounds it has decided are the background of the night. I lay very still in my bag. I kept my eyes open in the dark. I listened. The rain was still falling. I could hear it on the fly. I listened past it. For a long moment, I heard nothing else. Then I heard the sound that had woken me, and I heard it clearly, and I went very still. Footsteps in the wet leaves. They were the footsteps of a man in boots. Heavy boots. The kind of boots someone wears for work, leather boots with thick soles, the kind that come down on the ground with a particular muted thud, even on wet ground. The footsteps were slow. They were not the footsteps of someone in a hurry. They were the footsteps of someone who had been walking for a long time and was tired. The kind of pace a person walks at the end of a long day, when the body is moving without enthusiasm, but is still moving steadily. The footsteps were coming from somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing. They were getting closer. I lay in my bag, and I did not move. My first thought was that it was Caleb, that he had gotten up to use the bathroom, that he had decided to walk into the woods to relieve himself, that I was hearing him on the wet leaves. But the footsteps were not coming from the direction of his tent. They were coming from beyond it, from the woods on the far side of his tent, and they were heading toward the clearing. And there had been no sound of a tent flap being unzipped. I had heard him zip his tent shut after he had said good night, and the canvas on nylon sound of a tent flap is a sound a person hears whether they want to or not in a quiet camp. I would have woken to that sound. I had not. The footsteps were not his. The footsteps came up to the edge of the clearing. They walked across the wet leaves toward my tent. They were no longer hurried by the steady drag of the long day. They were now the careful footsteps of a person who knew where they were going and who had decided not to rush the last few paces. They came up to the side of my tent, on the side closest to the trees, and they stopped. I lay completely still. I did not move my arms. I did not turn my head. I kept my breathing slow and shallow. I could not see anything outside the tent. The rain fly was zipped tight, and the mesh of the inner door was facing the other direction, toward Caleb's tent, and there was nothing for me to see, even if I had unzipped the fly, because the dark of the woods at that hour in steady rain was a dark that did not give anything up. I could only listen. The boots did not move for a long time. I am going to try to describe what that stillness was like. There is a quality to silence when you know that something living is on the other side of a wall from you, holding still on purpose. The silence has a weight. It has a direction. You feel the listener even when you cannot see them. I lay in my tent, and I felt the person on the other side of the canvas as clearly as I would have felt them if they had been in the tent with me. They were close. They were maybe 2 feet from my head. The canvas of my tent was the only thing between us. They had stopped at the side of my tent, and they had decided not to move, and they were standing in the rain in their heavy boots, and they were doing whatever a person does when they are standing 2 feet from a sleeping man's head in the middle of the night in a state forest in May. I do not know how long they stood there. It was a long time. I counted my heartbeats, the way you count things when you are afraid, and you need a structure to hold the fear inside. I counted to 200 and lost count and started over. I counted past 200 a second time. The boots did not move. The rain kept falling. Then the boots walked slowly around my tent. I do not have a better way to describe it. The footsteps took up again at the side of my tent, and they moved in a slow, careful walk around the tent in a complete circle. The boots were not stepping carelessly. They were not making the noise that boots make when a person is walking through wet leaves to get somewhere. They were walking the way a person walks when they are paying attention to what they are passing, the kind of walk a person uses when they are looking at something carefully from every angle. The boots went around my tent, one full time, slowly, and then they crossed the small space of clearing between my tent and Caleb's tent. And they began to walk, in the same slow, careful pace, around Caleb's tent. I lay in my bag, and I listened to those boots walk a complete circle around my brother's tent. I could hear them clearly. The rain was steady, but it did not cover the sound of the boots on the leaves. The boots went around Caleb's tent in the same patient way they had gone around mine, the same slow circle, the same close walking distance to the canvas. I lay in my bag and I prayed, in the way I had not prayed since I was a child, that my brother would not wake up, that he would not unzip his tent flap to see what was making the sound, that he would sleep through it. The boots finished their circle of Caleb's tent. They walked back across the small space between our tents, and they stopped at the spot directly between us. In the center of the clearing, 10 feet from each of us. They stopped there. The boots did not move. I do not know how long they stood there. I have thought about this many times in the years since. It was at least 20 minutes. It might have been longer. The rain kept falling. The dark of the tent stayed dark. I lay in my bag with my eyes open, and I listened to the sound of nothing, the patient, silent presence of a person standing in the rain, in the middle of the night, between two tents, containing two sleeping brothers, doing whatever they were doing, deciding whatever they were deciding. I do not know what they were thinking. I do not know what they were comparing. I do not know what conclusion they were reaching about us. I know only that they stood there for a very long time, and that I did not move, and that I did not breathe loudly enough to be heard from outside the tent, and that I waited with a patience that was its own kind of agony for the boots to do whatever they had come to do. Eventually, the boots moved. They walked away. They walked slowly back across the wet leaves to the edge of the clearing. And then they walked into the trees. And then their sound got softer. And then their sound was gone. I lay in my bag, and I listened for the boots to come back. They did not. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, the rain had eased to a light drizzle. The light through the rainfly was the pale gray of early morning. I waited until I could hear Caleb stirring in his tent. He unzipped his flap and called good morning across to me. I called good morning back. My voice sounded normal. I think it sounded normal. I crawled out of my tent and I stood in the wet clearing in my socks and my boots, and I looked at the ground around our tents. I looked carefully. The leaves were wet and trampled where we had walked the day before. There were no clear boot prints anywhere. The leaves do not take prints well. I do not know what I would have done if I had seen prints. I do not know what I would have done if I had not. Caleb came out of his tent and started making coffee on the little stove under the tarp. As he was filling the pot from a water bottle, he asked me, in a casual voice that I will think about for the rest of my life, if I had heard anything in the night. I looked at him over the small flame of the stove, and I made my face do whatever it needed to do, and I told him I had not heard anything. I told him I had slept like the dead. He nodded. He said he thought he had heard footsteps, but that he had figured it was a deer or a black bear coming through camp, and that he had gone back to sleep. I let him keep believing that. I have let him keep believing it for the 6 years since. We packed up that morning, and we hiked out and we drove home, and we have done 2 other camping trips together since, and I have never told him what walked around our tents in the rain in the middle of the night. I do not know why. I have told myself it is to protect him. I have told myself it is because there is no good reason to add a memory like that to a memory of a trip he otherwise remembers fondly. I have told myself I do not want him to stop wanting to camp with me. All of those things are true. But the deepest reason I have not told him is one I do not like to admit. I am afraid that if I tell him, he will tell me he heard more than he said. I am afraid he heard the boots stop at the side of his tent. I am afraid he heard them circle. I am afraid he heard them stand between us. I am afraid he was awake the whole time, the same way I was awake the whole time, listening, holding still, waiting. I am afraid I will find out we both lay there in our separate tents in the rain and decided, separately, to keep what we had heard from the other, because we were brothers, and because we loved each other, and because we had both understood that whoever had been walking around our tents had been comparing us to each other, and that comparison had taken a long time, and that neither of us has wanted to know, in the years since, which one of us they had finally chosen. I had been planning the trip for the better part of a year. I had come off a hard spring at the engineering firm where I worked, and I had told my wife in April that I needed a week alone in the high country before the summer started. And she had understood, the way she has always understood, and she had told me to take the time and to come back to her in one piece. I had picked the Rhone Highlands because I had hiked the Balds there once before with a friend and had never forgotten the country, the grassy domes above 6,000 feet, the long views in every direction, the wind that comes through the gap and carries the smell of the spruce. I wanted 4 nights up there. I wanted to be alone with the country. I had told my wife the route. I had given my son the dates I would be back. I had driven up on a Saturday morning in early June and parked at a trailhead off a forest road that I had been told would be quiet that time of year. The first day had been clear. I had hiked up to the first of the Balds in the late morning and had stopped to eat my lunch in the grass, with the view going out to the south for what looked like 50 miles. The wind had been steady but not hard. The sky had been the kind of high blue you get in early summer in the southern Appalachians, the kind that does not look like it has any rain in it for a week. I had camped that first night in a small flat spot just below the second Bald, and I had slept hard. The rain started in the middle of the second day. The system had come up faster than the forecast had said, the way systems do in the high country, and by noon the sky had gone the flat gray of a cloud ceiling that has settled in for a long stay. The rain had started as a fine mist and had turned to a steady, gentle rain by mid-afternoon and had not stopped since. I had put on my rain gear. I had kept walking. I had camped the second night in a small spruce grove just below the ridge, and I had slept poorly because the rain on the rainfly had been the kind of steady drumming that does not let the brain settle. The third day was the day I am writing this about. I had broken camp in the wet gray morning and had hiked along the ridgeline for most of the day. The visibility had been short. The fog had settled into the spruce and had thinned only occasionally when the wind would push it aside for a moment, and I would see down into the country to one side or the other, the dark green of the slopes falling away into the haze. The trail was mostly empty. I had passed 2 other hikers in the morning, a couple in their 30s, with proper packs and rain shells, and the particular focused expressions of people who had been walking in rain for too long. We had nodded at each other on a narrow stretch of trail. We had not spoken. I had not seen anyone else for the rest of the day. I had been on the trail for about 7 hours by the late afternoon. I was tired. The rain had been steady for 2 days, and the constant attention of putting one foot in front of the other on a wet trail had begun to grind me down in the way long trail days do. I was looking for a place to camp. I had a flat spot marked on the map, maybe another mile ahead, on the lee side of a small ridge where I knew there would be some shelter from the wind that had been picking up through the afternoon. I came up over a small rise in the trail at maybe 4:30 in the gray, failing light, and I stopped. There was a man sitting on a log about 30 yards down the trail from me. The log was a deadfall that had come down across a small open patch in the trees. The kind of log that hikers naturally rest on, a smooth, weathered trunk lying parallel to the trail with the bark long gone. The man was sitting on it the way a man sits on a park bench. His back was to a tree on the far side of the trail. His hands were resting on his knees. He was facing in my direction. He was looking down at the ground. The rain was falling on him. I want to describe what I saw, because the details have stayed with me in a way the rest of that trip has not. He was a man in his middle 50s, maybe a little older. He had short gray hair cut neatly. He was clean-shaven. He was not a small man, but he was not large. He was sitting upright with the kind of posture a man uses in a chair at a desk, his shoulders back, his back not touching the tree behind him. And he was not dressed for the woods. He was wearing slacks. Gray slacks, the kind a man wears to an office in a city, with a sharp crease that I could see even from 30 yards away, despite the rain. He was wearing a button-down shirt. White, or had been white. Now it was soaked through and clinging to him the way a wet white shirt does. He had no jacket. He had no hat. He had no pack. He had nothing leaning against the log next to him. He had no walking stick. He had no water bottle. He was not wearing hiking boots. He was wearing the kind of brown leather dress shoes a man wears to an office. And they were soaked dark with the rain. And the leather was streaked with mud at the edges, the way leather streaks when a man has walked through mud, and the leather has not been designed for it. He looked up. He saw me at the top of the rise, and he smiled at me. It was a polite smile. It was the smile a man gives a stranger on a city sidewalk when the eyes have met by accident, and the polite thing is to acknowledge the other person without saying anything. The smile sat on his face for a second, and then it relaxed, but he kept looking at me. He did not wave. He did not call out. He just looked at me and waited. I walked down the trail toward him slowly. I do not know what I thought I was doing. I think I thought he must be lost. I think I thought he was a tourist who had wandered off a parking area at some pull-off, somewhere down on a forest road, the way tourists sometimes do, and had gotten farther into the country than he had intended. I think I thought he needed help. I came up to the log, and I stopped about 10 feet away from him. He did not stand. He smiled at me again, the same polite smile, and he said hello. I said hello back. I asked him if he was all right. He said he was fine. His voice was even and warm. He had no accent that I could place. He sounded like a man on a phone call in an office, the kind of voice that has spent a lot of years in meetings. I told him he looked like he had gotten caught out in the weather. He nodded. He said he had gotten turned around earlier. He used that phrase, turned around. He said it lightly. The way you say something is a small inconvenience. I asked him how long he had been out there. He thought about it. He looked at the air in front of him for a moment as if he was calculating. Then he said, "A few hours." He smiled at me again, as if to confirm. A few hours. I looked at his shirt. The shirt was not the shirt of a man who had been out in steady rain for a few hours. The shirt was soaked through completely. Beyond soaked, the collar had begun to come away from the placket the way fabric does when it has been wet for a very long time. The cuffs at the wrists were the kind of pale gray-brown that white fabric goes when it has been wet for days. His hair was wet, but his hair was not the kind of plastered down wet. A man's hair gets in heavy rain after the first hour. It looked like it had been wet for so long that the rain was no longer making it wetter. The way a wet thing reaches an equilibrium with the air around it. He was sitting on a log in rain, that he had clearly been in for a great deal longer than a few hours. And I didn't know how to ask him about that. I asked him if he had a phone. He said no. I asked him if he had a watch. He said no. I asked him if he had any gear at all that he might have set down somewhere off the trail. He said no, that he had been walking light. He used those words, walking light. He smiled at me when he said it. I asked him where he had come from. He said he had been visiting the area. He did not say where he had come from. He did not say a town or a state. I asked him where his car was parked. He said it was not far. He smiled and he gestured vaguely with one hand in the direction of the trail I had come from. He did not name a trailhead. He did not name a road. He did not name a parking area. The vagueness was the vagueness of a man who did not want to be impolite by giving an answer he did not have. I took off my rain jacket. I held it out to him. I told him he should put it on. He looked at the jacket in my hand. He smiled at me again, and he shook his head very slightly. He told me in a voice that was as warm as it had been that he was fine and that he did not need it. I told him he was going to get hypothermic. I told him the rain was going to get colder as the sun went down. I told him I had a spare base layer in my pack he could have. He shook his head again. He thanked me. He said I should keep my own gear. He did not look cold. I want to be specific about that. He did not shiver. He was sitting in soaked office clothes in a steady rain that I could feel coming through my own jacket, and he was not shivering. His hands on his knees were as still as if he had been sitting in a warm room. I asked him if he wanted me to walk him back to the trailhead. I told him it was not far, that I had come from the lower trailhead off Forest Road 130, that I could get him back there before full dark if we left now. He shook his head. He thanked me again. He said he was just resting, that I should go on, that someone was coming to get him. I asked him who. He looked at me, and the smile relaxed off his face for a moment, the only time in our exchange that the smile was not there. He looked at me steadily, and he did not answer. Then the smile came back, the same polite smile, and he said again that I should go on, that he was just resting, that someone was coming. I stood on the trail for a moment longer. I do not know how long. I could not think of anything else to say. He was sitting on the log, and he was looking at me with that smile, and his clothes were soaked, and his shoes were ruined, and he did not shiver, and he had told me twice to go on. The trail behind him went deeper into the country. The trail behind me went back the way I had come. There was no road for many miles in either direction. There was no place a person could have been picked up from. Someone coming to get him was not a thing that could happen in that country. I knew that. He must have known that. I looked at him, and I felt the slow, uncomfortable feeling come into my chest that I had not had a name. For at first, the feeling of being in the presence of something that did not fit, and I said all right, and I told him to take care, and I walked past him on the trail. I went on. I did not look back for the first 100 yards. I do not know why I did not look back. I think I was afraid he would still be looking at me with the same polite smile, and I did not want to see it. I came up the next small rise, and I stopped at the top of it, and I made myself turn around. The log was empty. I could see it clearly from the top of the rise. The same log, the same open patch in the trees, the same tree behind it. He was not on the log. He was not standing next to the log. He was not anywhere in the open patch, or in the trees on either side of the trail. I had been gone less than 2 minutes. I had not heard him stand. I had not heard him walk in any direction. The trail in both directions was visible from where I stood, and there was no figure on it, no man in white shirt receding away from me, no man in dress shoes climbing toward me. The log sat in the rain. The fog moved through the spruce. I stood at the top of the rise for a long time. The light was failing. I did not go back to look at the log. I turned around and I walked on, and I made camp at the spot I had marked on the map, in the lee of the small ridge, and I did not sleep much that night. And I hiked out the next day without doing the fourth night of my trip. I drove home and I told my wife about the trip, in the way you tell a wife about a trip, the parts that fit in the conversation. And I did not tell her about the man on the log. I checked the news in the weeks after. I checked the local papers from Carter County and Mitchell County and Avery County, and I checked the search and rescue logs that get posted publicly. I looked for any report of a missing man in his 50s, in slacks and a white shirt, anywhere in the Roan Highlands region. I looked for 2 weeks. There was nothing. There was no missing person of any age in any of those counties for any of those days. There had been no search and rescue calls in that section of the Highlands. No body had been found anywhere in the area in the months that followed. I do not know what happened to the man I saw. I do not know who he was. I do not know who he had been waiting for, or who had been coming to get him, or whether someone had come. I do not know whether he had been sitting on that log for a few hours or for a few days, or for very much longer than that. I have wondered, in the years since, whether the answer he could not give me, when I asked who was coming, was an answer that did not have a name in any language I would have recognized, and whether the smile he gave me when he could not answer was the smile of a man who was being patient with me because he understood that I was not the person who had been expected on that trail, and that the person who had been expected would have known not to ask. We had been planning the trip for most of the summer. There were 4 of us. Mark and I had been friends since college, and the other 2, Dean and Will, had come into the group later, through Mark, the way friendships build outward when you stay in the same city long enough. We were all in our early 30s by then, all working jobs that did not give us much in the way of long stretches off, and we had agreed at the beginning of the summer that we would take a long weekend in October to do a backcountry trip together in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The park requires permits for backcountry sites, and we had reserved a designated site on a loop trail that went through one of the quieter sections of the park, a section that did not see the heavy traffic the bigger trails got. The site was about 6 miles in from the trailhead, in a small clearing by a creek, on a flat shelf of ground that the Park Service had marked with a metal post and a small fire ring of stones. We drove out on a Friday afternoon. The weather forecast had not been kind. The system had been hanging over East Tennessee for most of the week, and the rain that had been forecast for the weekend was the kind of slow, steady rain that the Smokies get in late October, the kind that does not have any thunder in it, but does not stop either. We had all the right gear. We had been talking about the trip too long to let the weather cancel it. We parked at the trailhead in the early afternoon, and we shouldered our packs and we walked into the rain. The hike in took us about 3 hours. The trail was wet, but not bad. The leaves were past their peak in the high country, and the maples had mostly dropped. But the oaks were still holding on, and the wet leaves on the ground gave off the smell of late autumn, that earthy, faintly sweet smell that the Smokies have when the rain has been falling on the duff for a while. We came into the site in the late afternoon. There was no one else there. The site had room for 2 tents and a designated fire ring in the center, and the 4 of us pitched 2 tents about 8 feet apart, Mark and I sharing one, and Dean and Will sharing the other. We built a fire in the ring. We had brought wood from outside the park in the way you have to in the Smokies, because they do not let you cut wood. Dean got the fire going under a small tarp. We rigged off a low branch, and we cooked supper around it. As the light went down through the rain, we talked the way four friends talk when they have not been together in the woods in a long time. We laughed at old jokes. We argued, in the way we argued, about old arguments. The fire crackled. The rain kept falling on the tarp. By 10 o'clock, the rain had picked up. The four of us looked at each other, and we agreed it was time to call it. We banked the fire down, and we put the food in the bear cables, strung between two trees at the edge of the site, and we crawled into our two tents, and we zipped up the flaps, and we got into our sleeping bags. I lay in the dark in the tent, next to Mark, and I listened to the rain on the rainfly, and I went to sleep within a few minutes. I do not know what time I woke. I came up out of sleep, the way you come up out of sleep, when something has been brought to your attention in the next tent, the small awareness that someone close to you has done something they would not normally do. I lay in the dark for a long moment, and I listened. The rain was still falling. The fly above me was a steady drumming. I could not place what had woken me. Then I heard Mark's voice. He was whispering. He whispered my name. It was a hoarse whisper, the kind of whisper a man uses when he is trying not to be heard, but does not have the breath in him to keep his voice fully under control. He was not in my tent. He had unzipped his flap and was leaning out into the rain and was whispering across the gap. He whispered my name twice. Then he whispered, very quietly, that I should look out the front of my tent. I lay in my bag for a moment. I did not understand what he was asking me to do. The night had been quiet except for the rain. There had been no sound of anyone coming into the camp. There had been no voices, no footsteps, no animal sounds. I thought for a long second that Mark must have heard a bear. We had been told about black bears at the trail briefing. They were not aggressive, the rangers had said, but they would come into a site looking for food if the food was not properly hung. We had hung the food, but that was the only thing I could think of that Mark might have wanted me to see. I sat up slowly in the bag. I unzipped the flap of my own tent as quietly as I could manage. The zipper was loud in my ears. I worked it open one tooth at a time. When the flap was open enough to look through, I leaned forward and I looked out into the clearing. There was a second fire burning at the edge of the site. I want to describe what I saw, because the details have stayed with me for 15 years now. There was a small fire, maybe 15 yards from the front of my tent, at the edge of the clearing where the trees started. It was not in any fire ring. It was burning on the wet ground. The flames were small, maybe a foot tall at their highest, the careful contained fire of a man who knows how to build a fire small and keep it small. The fire was burning, despite the rain, which I could see falling through the firelight in thin, steady lines. There was a man squatting next to the fire. He had his back to us. He was wearing what looked like a long, dark coat, the kind of coat that comes down past the knees, and a wide-brimmed hat that was pulled low. I could see only his back and the side of his hat. He was squatting on his heels with the easy balance of a man who has spent a lot of his life squatting like that, and his hands were busy in front of him, doing something I could not see. He had a stick in his hand. He was holding the stick over the fire. He was slowly turning it. The stick had something on the end of it. I could not see what. I stared at him for a long time without moving. The rain kept falling. His fire kept burning. He kept turning the stick. The motion was very slow and very even, the way a man turns meat over a fire when he wants it to cook on every side. The fire did not flicker the way a fire flickers in rain. It did not sputter. It did not throw up the kind of small explosions of steam that wet wood makes when the heat hits the moisture inside. It burned the way a fire burns in a still, dry kitchen. I do not know how long I sat there before I leaned my head back into the tent and whispered across to Mark. He was already at the flap of his own tent. I could see his face in the dark, pale, the way a face goes pale when the body has decided to put all of its blood somewhere else. He whispered to me that Dean and Will were awake in the other tent too. They had unzipped their flap a few minutes before I had. They were watching. None of us had moved. None of us had called out. I do not know why we did not call out. It would have been the natural thing to do. To say hello, the way you say hello in a campsite when another camper has set up nearby, even at a strange hour. To ask the man if he needed anything. To remind him, in the polite way hikers remind each other, that he was building a fire outside a designated ring in a national park, where it was not allowed to do any of the small social things a person does when they encounter another person in the woods. We did none of them. I think we all understood, in some part of our minds that does not need to talk to itself to know what it knows, that we should not call out to the man at the second fire, that whatever he was doing in a way that he did not want to be interrupted, and that calling out would not produce the response that calling out usually produces. We watched him. The four of us, in our two tents, with our flaps unzipped just enough to see, watched the man squatting by the small fire at the edge of our clearing for almost 2 hours. He did not look up. He did not look behind him. He did not stand. He squatted on his heels the entire time, turning the stick over the flames with the same slow, even motion he had been using when I had first seen him. The thing on the end of the stick I never identified. It was not large. It was a small, dark shape that the firelight did not show clearly from where I was. I tried not to look at it too long. I made my eyes look at the back of his coat and the wide brim of his hat instead, because the dark shape on the stick made me feel things I did not want to feel. The fire burned the whole time. It did not need to be fed. He did not add wood to it. He did not poke at it. He did not adjust the burning. The flames stayed the same height for the entire 2 hours. They did not climb higher. They did not die down. The rain kept falling on the fire, and the fire kept burning, and the flames stayed exactly the same size, and the man kept turning the stick. Mark whispered to me at some point that we should get the Rangers in the morning. I whispered back that we should. Neither of us moved to get our phones. We did not want to make a sound. The man was 15 yards away. He had not given any sign that he knew we were watching him. He had not looked up, but there was a quality to his stillness that did not feel like the stillness of a man who did not know. It felt like the stillness of a man who was being polite, who was giving us the courtesy of not looking, who was letting us watch, because he was doing what he was there to do, and he had no interest in us interfering with it, but who knew exactly where we were, and exactly that our flaps were unzipped, and exactly that the four of us were sitting in our sleeping bags with our eyes on his back. I am going to say something that I have not been able to say in the years since to anyone. I felt, the entire time I watched him, that he had built that fire knowing we were there, that he had picked our site on purpose, that whatever he was doing was something he wanted us to see in the limited way he was letting us see it, without our being able to see the parts he was keeping from us. After what I think was almost 2 hours, the fire began to die down. He did not put it out. He did not stomp on it. He did not throw water on it. The fire just got smaller. The flames lowered, slowly, until they were just embers. And then the embers darkened. The man squatted next to the fading fire. For another long moment, the stick still in his hand. Then he stood up. He stood up in one smooth motion, the way a man who has squatted for a long time does not usually stand. He did not stretch. He did not look around. He turned and walked into the trees behind him, and he was gone. We waited. I do not know how long. None of us moved for a long time after the fire was out. We sat in our sleeping bags, with our flaps open just enough to see, and we watched the spot where the fire had been, and we waited for him to come back, and he did not come back. The rain kept falling. The dark of the clearing was complete. I do not know when I fell asleep. I do not know if I fell asleep. I think at some point, the exhaustion of the long day and the cold and the held tension made my body shut down, and I came up in the gray light of morning with my flaps still partly open and my sleeping bag wet at the foot from the rain that had come in. Mark was already up. He was standing in the clearing in his rain jacket, looking at the spot where the fire had been. I got out of the tent. I walked over to him. Dean and Will came out of their tent and joined us. There was nothing there. I do not have a better way to say it. The wet leaves on the ground where the fire had been were the same wet leaves as the leaves anywhere else in the clearing. There was no scorch on the ground. There was no ash. There was no charred wood. There was no rock that had been used to bank the fire. There was no place a fire could have been built without leaving any mark on the ground that had been under it. We crouched down. We pushed the wet leaves aside. The earth under the leaves was wet and cold and unburned. We checked the spot from every angle. We could not find any sign that a fire had ever been in that part of the clearing. We did not speak. We packed up. We rolled the tents wet into the packs, and we shouldered the packs, and we hiked out, and we did the 6 miles back to the trailhead in less than 2 hours, and we got into Mark's truck, and we drove out of the park. We did not stop until we were back in Knoxville. We did not get the Rangers. We did not file any report. We did not, in the days and weeks after, talk much about what we had seen. We have talked about it, the 4 of us, exactly 3 times in the 15 years since. Each time has been brief. Each time has ended quickly, by mutual agreement, when the conversation has reached the part where we would have to say what we think the man was cooking, and what he was doing in the rain in a national park backcountry site at 2 in the morning, and why he had built his fire 15 yards from our tents on the only wet patch of ground in the country that night. That fire was burning, and we have never, in 15 years, made it past that part. We have not been back to the Smokies. Not one of us. I do not know if I ever will be. I think about the fire sometimes when it rains at night. I think about how it burned in the wet. I think about how he turned the stick. I think about the courtesy of his stillness, and I have wondered, more than I want to admit, what we were being shown, and why we were being shown it, and whether the showing was the only thing he had needed from us, or whether the showing was meant to make us remember, all the years afterward, that he was out there. I had been going alone into the Nantahala National Forest for almost 10 years by the time the night I am writing about happened. I lived in Greenville, South Carolina, and I worked a job I did not love at a logistics company, and the woods of western North Carolina were the place I went when I needed to feel like the rest of my life was not the only thing. I had a small set of trails I returned to often, and a few sections I had hiked enough times that I no longer needed the map for them, and one stretch of the forest in particular that I had taken to camping in, because I had never, in any of the years I had been going there, seen another person on the trail. It was a section in the upper part of the forest, off a forest road that took an hour of careful driving on gravel to reach, with a small footpath that left the road and climbed up into a stand of old hemlocks along a creek. There was no marked campsite on the path. There were no other trails that intersected it. The path went up the creek for about 2 miles, and then ended at the foot of a steep slope where a person could turn around and come back. I had been hiking that section for years and had never met another person on it. I had driven up on a Friday afternoon in late September of 2017. The weather was supposed to be cool and clear for the weekend. I had a 3-day pass from work, and I wanted 2 nights in the high country before the cold set in for the year. I parked at the small pull-off at the end of the forest road, and I shouldered my pack, and I walked up the path along the creek. I came to my usual spot in the early evening, a small flat shelf of ground above the creek where I had pitched a tent maybe a dozen times before. I set up. I cooked supper. The first night was uneventful. I slept hard. I woke late. The second day I hiked further up the path than I had ever gone before. I had been meaning to do it for years. I went all the way to the end of the path where it ended at the foot of the slope, and I sat on a rock there for a long time and ate my lunch and watched the creek run down through the moss. I came back down to camp in the late afternoon. The sky had darkened while I had been walking. The forecast I had checked on Friday morning had not mentioned rain, but the high country has its own weather, and by the time I got back to my tent, the wind had picked up and the first drops had started to fall. The rain came in hard around 6. It was the kind of rain that does not build up gradually. It went from the first scattered drops to a steady drumming inside of 10 minutes. And by the time I had retreated, under the small tarp I had rigged off the ridgepole, the rain was coming down so loudly on the tarp that I could not hear the creek 20 feet from where I was sitting. I ate supper standing up under the tarp. I cleaned up the stove with the rain blowing in sideways at me. By 7:30 the light was failing, and there was nothing more to do outside, and I crawled into the tent in my dry clothes, and I zipped up the flap behind me. I lay in the dark, and I listened to the rain on the rainfly. It was a deafening rain. It was the kind of rain that you can lie in your tent and feel the sound of in your chest, the steady thunder of water on the fabric above you. I read on my phone for a while, with the screen brightness turned down low. I tried to sleep around 9 and could not. The rain was too loud. The cold had come in with the rain, the way it does in the high country in late September when a front moves in, and I had pulled the bag up around my shoulders and was lying with my eyes open in the dark of the tent for a long time before I finally went under. I do not remember waking up at any point during the night. The rain did not let up. I would have heard nothing through the drumming on the fly, even if there had been anything to hear. I slept the way you sleep, when the rain has been hammering on a tent for hours, and the cold has settled into the bag with you, and the body has decided to give itself over to the warmth it has been able to make. I came up in the gray light of morning, with the rain still falling, lighter now, the way the second day of a system feels lighter even when it is still raining. I sat up in the bag. I made the decision to make coffee outside under the tarp, rather than try to use the stove in the vestibule. I pulled on a pair of dry wool socks, and I unzipped the flap of the tent, and I crawled out into the wet morning in my socks, the way I have done 100 mornings on 100 camping trips, because the ground around the tent was leaf-covered and reasonably clean, and my boots were under the tarp. I took 2 steps away from the tent. Then I took a third. Then I stopped. The ground around my tent was bare mud. The rain had washed away the leaves that had been there the night before. The ground was a slick brown surface, the kind of mud that takes a print and holds it, and the mud all the way around my tent was covered in footprints. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw. The footprints were bare feet, adult feet. Adult feet are not the feet of a child or a small animal or a deer. and these were clearly adult. The arches were the arches of full-grown human feet. The toes were the toes of full-grown human feet. The length of each print was the length of an adult shoe. The depth of the prints in the mud was the depth that an adult's weight leaves when an adult is walking, not running, not standing still, just walking. The prints had been left by someone walking around my tent at a steady pace, putting their full weight down on each step, the way a person walks when they are not in any hurry and are not trying to be quiet. And there were many of them. The prints had walked in a complete circle around my tent. The circle was tight. The prints were close to the rainfly, no more than a foot from the edge of the tent at any point in the circle. And the prints overlapped each other. Many of them. The mud was a confusion of overlapping bare feet, the way mud gets when a single person paces back and forth across the same patch of ground over and over again. I crouched down. I tried to count. I gave up on counting actual prints and tried to count what I thought of as passes, the discrete trips around the tent that the same person had made. I could pick out, in some places, where one circle had been laid over another, the way you can sometimes pick out one person's tracks from another's, if you look carefully at the angles. I counted what I thought were at least 30 passes around the tent. I might have been undercounting. The prints were so heavily layered in places that I could not separate them. The rain was still falling. I could see, as I crouched there, that the prints were slowly filling with water. The deeper ones had small puddles in them already. The shallower ones were still clearly defined. The rain had been falling lightly for at least the last hour, I knew, because I had heard it ease in my sleep before the gray light had begun to come up. The prints were not yet washed out. They had been laid into the mud recently enough that the rain had not yet erased them. Someone had walked around my tent in bare feet more than 30 times, very close to the rainfly, sometime in the last hour or two before I had woken up. I stood up slowly. I looked around the small clearing. The woods around me were the woods I had been camping in for years. The hemlocks, the creek, the fern beds. There was no one there. The forest in every direction was empty. The rain was falling on the leaves. I could see no figure standing anywhere among the trees, and I could see, when I looked at the ground at the edges of the clearing, that the bare footprints did not seem to go into the woods in any one direction. They ended at the edge of the clearing on every side, and then they did not appear in the leaf litter beyond, where the leaves were too thick and wet to take a print. Wherever the person had come from, and wherever they had gone, the woods had swallowed their tracks. I want to tell you what I felt. I felt the cold come into my chest that was not the cold of the rain. I felt the small, slow lifting of the hair on the back of my neck that I have only felt a few times in my life. I felt my hands begin to shake. I felt my mind try to construct alternative explanations for what I was seeing, and I felt each of the explanations fail before I had fully thought it through. A bear with damaged feet. A man who had been lost and had taken off his boots for some reason. A trick the rain was playing on the mud. None of them held. The prints were bare feet, and they were adult feet, and they were many feet, and they had been walked around my tent at a steady pace many times, very close to where I had been sleeping. I tried to think about whether the person had ever been still. I crouched down again, and I looked. I looked at the prints in the places where they had stopped, where they had paused, where they had clustered. There were 3 places where the prints overlapped most heavily. One was just outside the door of my tent. One was on the long side, near where my head would have been when I was lying in my bag. One was at the back. The 3 positions where a person might have stopped to listen most closely. If a person had been listening for something inside the tent. The places where, if you were the person walking around the outside, you would naturally pause to hear better. To stand and lean a little closer to the canvas, and to listen for the sound of a sleeping man's breathing through the rainfly, and to confirm that the man inside was still asleep before continuing the circle. I have wondered, in the years since, how long the person was walking around my tent. The rain had been the steady thunder it had been from 7 until what I think was around 3 or 4 in the morning. After that, the rain had eased, the way I knew it had, because the prints were still in the mud. The person had walked 30 times around my tent at a slow pace. Even at a slow pace, that would have taken perhaps 30 minutes. Even at a slower pace, with the long pauses at the 3 listening places, it might have taken an hour. The walking had happened in the time between when the rain had been loud enough to cover any sound the person made and when I had woken up. They had walked while I was asleep, and they had walked at a pace that suggested they had no fear of being discovered. And they had walked close to the canvas of my tent, and they had stopped at the places where they could best hear me. I do not know what they were listening for. I have wondered more than I want to admit. I have wondered whether they were listening to make sure I was sleeping the way a person checks to make sure another person is fully asleep before they do something. I have wondered whether they were listening to a sound I was making in my sleep that had drawn them to the tent in the first place, snoring or breathing or talking, and whether they had been studying the sound. I have wondered whether they had been waiting for the sound to change, for me to wake up, for some signal that would have triggered them to do whatever they had been there to do. I have wondered most of all how they had decided to stop. There must have been a moment, in the dark before dawn, when the person walking around my tent had decided that the circle was complete, that they had walked enough, that whatever they had come to do or to learn had been done or learned. They had stopped somewhere in the middle of the night, and they had walked away into the woods, and they had not come back. I do not know what had been the thing that made them stop. I have wondered, in particular, whether they had stopped because they had been satisfied, or whether they had stopped because they had been interrupted. The way a person stops a task when something pulls them away to attend to it. The second possibility has been the one that has not let me sleep well in the years since. I packed up that morning faster than I have ever packed up a camp. I did not make coffee. I did not eat breakfast. I rolled the tent wet, and I jammed it into the pack, and I shouldered the pack, and I started down the trail. I did not look at the prints again. I had seen what I had needed to see. I walked the 2 miles back down the path to the forest road, and I got in my car and I drove down the gravel for an hour back to the paved road. And I did not stop until I was almost home in Greenville, 3 hours later. I have not been back to that section of the Nantahala. I have not been back to any section of the Nantahala. I have done some shorter trips in other forests in the years since, always with another person, always in places where there are other tents within sight. I do not camp alone anymore. I think about the prints sometimes. I think about how patient they had been. I think about the 3 places where the person had stopped to listen. I think about how I had been sleeping the whole time, and I have wondered, in the way you wonder things you cannot prove, whether the reason I have wondered the second possibility for so many years is that I am afraid the person did not stop on their own, and that they will, one day, finish whatever it was they had been beginning, and I will not be there to hear them coming. Jordan and I had been roommates our last 2 years of college. And after we both graduated and moved to different cities for different jobs, we had stayed close, in the way good friends stay close when they have lived together long enough to have absorbed each other's small habits. He had gone to Cincinnati, and I had gone to Louisville, and we had taken to seeing each other every couple of months by meeting somewhere in the middle, sometimes at a bar in Lexington, and sometimes at a state park for a weekend hike. The fall after our first year out of school, Jordan called me in early October and asked if I wanted to do a longer trip than usual, 2 nights in the backcountry in the Daniel Boone National Forest, in a section he had been wanting to get into for a long time. He had been doing more solo camping than I had, and he was more comfortable in country I would have called rough. I said yes. I trusted his judgment about the country. I had not done a backcountry trip in over a year, and I wanted to get back to it. We drove out separately on a Friday afternoon and met at the trailhead. The forecast had been mixed all week. The system that had been hovering over central Kentucky for the previous few days was supposed to clear by Saturday, but the early forecasts had not held up, and by the time we shouldered our packs at the trailhead, the sky was the flat, low gray of a cloud ceiling that had decided to stay for the weekend. We hiked in along a small creek trail for about 4 miles. The trail climbed steadily, switching back twice, and we came up onto a small bench of flat ground just below a ridgeline in the late afternoon. The bench was about the size of a small backyard, screened from the trail by a band of mountain laurel, with the ridge rising up to our south and the slope falling away to the north, into a hollow we could not see in the gathering dusk. We pitched our 2 tents about 6 feet apart, both facing the same direction. Jordan got a small fire going under a tarp he had rigged off a low branch. We cooked supper. The first scattered rain came in around 8, and by 10 the rain was steady, and by 10:30 we had banked the fire and crawled into our tents and zipped up the flaps. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I listened to the rain on the rain fly. The temperature had dropped with the rain, and I had pulled the bag up to my chin. I did not sleep right away. The rain was steady but not loud, and I lay there for a long time listening to it on the fly, and to the soft sounds of Jordan settling in his tent beside me. Around midnight the rain eased. I noticed it the way you notice a sound dropping out of the background of your hearing. The drumming on the rainfly got quieter, and then stopped, except for the slow drip of water from the trees above us. The wind had died too. The bench went very quiet in the way the woods go quiet when a rain has just stopped, and the night sounds have not yet returned. I lay in my bag, and I let myself start to drift toward sleep. Then I heard the whistling. It was coming from the ridge above us. I could tell that immediately. The sound was high and clear, and it was coming from somewhere above the bench, somewhere up on the spine of the ridge that ran east-west along our south side. The whistling was a tune. I want to be specific about that. It was not random whistling. It was a real tune. 4 notes. 2 long, 2 short, the long notes lower than the short ones. The 4 notes repeated. They were not the notes of any song I recognized, but they were not the random rising and falling of an absent-minded whistle either. They were a deliberate small phrase, the kind of small phrase a person might whistle to themselves while they were working on something, without really thinking about it. I lay still in the tent and I listened to the whistling. After a moment, I heard Jordan shift in his sleeping bag in the tent beside me. He had heard it too. We did not call to each other. The whistling went on. The 4 notes repeated and repeated. The pitch did not waver. The pacing did not vary. The person who was whistling was not stopping to take a breath in any way I could hear, but the whistling never sounded strained, the way a person's whistling gets strained when they have been at it for a while. It was easy. It was unhurried. It was a tune being held in the air on the ridge above us, the way a song stays in the head of a person doing some quiet work. I lay in my bag and I tried to make sense of it. The country we were in was country I had thought of as wilderness. The trailhead had been an hour's drive from any town. The 4 miles in on the trail had been 4 miles in which we had not seen a single other person or any sign of recent passage. The campsite Jordan had picked was on a small bench he had said he had been to before and had never seen anyone else on. But the country was a national forest, not a wilderness area, and other backpackers could be in it. The whistling had to be another camper. Someone who had pitched their tent up on the ridge above the bench, where neither of us would have thought to camp because there was no flat ground up there I had seen on the map. Someone who had gotten up in the night, or who had been sitting outside their tent, enjoying the break in the rain, and who was whistling to themselves, the way a person does in the woods. At night, when they think they are alone, the whistling went on. I have a hard time describing how long it went on. I know it went on for at least half an hour, because at some point during it, I checked my watch, which I had set down on the floor of the tent beside my head. It was 12:30 when I checked, and the whistling had been going for what I thought had been about 15 minutes by then. It continued for at least another 15 minutes after that. The same 4 notes, in the same order, with the same pacing. The whistler did not seem to need to rest. They did not seem to need to change the tune. They did not vary it. They did not embellish it. They held the 4 notes in the air over the ridge with a patience that I could not quite explain to myself. Then the whistle started to move. I noticed it gradually. The first thing I noticed was that the whistling sounded a little closer than it had been. Not by much, just enough that I sat up in my sleeping bag and tilted my head toward the front of the tent. I listened. The whistling continued. It sounded closer still. The pitch of the notes was the same, but the pacing was the same. But the source had moved. The whistler was no longer on the spine of the ridge above us. They were on the slope between the ridge and the bench, descending toward our camp. I heard Jordan whisper my name from his tent. I whispered back. We did not say anything else. The whistling kept coming closer. After another minute or so, I could hear faintly the sound of feet on wet leaves. The leaves were soft from the rain, and the steps were soft and patient. But the slope was steep enough that the descent was not silent. The person coming down was not crashing. They were not hurrying. They were walking carefully, the way a person walks down a wet slope in the dark. And they were whistling the same 4 notes the whole time. The whistling came down the slope toward our camp at the pace of a slow, careful walk. The 4 notes went on. The footsteps got closer. I could hear them clearly now, the soft press of a foot on the wet leaves, followed by a small pause, and then another press, the rhythm of a person who is being deliberate but not stealthy. The footsteps and the whistling came down the slope together, until they had reached the edge of the band of mountain laurel that screened our camp from the slope to the south. They stopped. The person came to the edge of the laurel, and they stopped walking, and the whistling stopped at the same moment. The cutoff was clean. It was not a wind down of the tune to a final note. The whistler did not finish their 4-note phrase. They stopped on the 3rd note of a repetition, or maybe the 2nd. The tune just ended, mid-phrase, the way a person stops talking when they have heard something that has caught their attention. The footsteps stopped at the same instant the whistling did. The whistler was standing about 30 feet from our tents, just inside the tree line at the edge of the bench, behind the screen of laurel. And they were no longer making any sound at all. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I did not move. I kept my breathing as quiet as I could. I listened. The bench was completely silent. The rain had not picked up again. The wind had not come up. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the leaves of the trees, and even that was sporadic. The whistler did not move. They did not whistle. They did not call out. They did not announce themselves to us in any of the ways a real other camper would have announced themselves at that point in the encounter, by calling hello, by asking if we had room for another tent, by giving us any signal of their being a friendly stranger. They just stood at the edge of the laurel. I do not know how long they stood there. I lay in my tent and I waited. I waited for the whistling to start up again. I waited for the footsteps to either come closer or retreat. I waited for any sound that would have indicated movement. The soft rustle of clothing, the small intake of breath, of a person standing in the cold, the creak of a foot shifting weight on wet leaves. I heard nothing. The person at the edge of the laurel had stopped, and they had stopped completely, and they were standing in the dark 30 feet from our tents, and they were not making any sound at all. I lay there for what I think was at least an hour. I do not have a way to know for sure. I did not look at my watch again. I did not want to make the small movement it would have required to pick it up. I lay on my back with my eyes open in the dark of the tent, and I waited, and the bench stayed silent. At some point, I started to think the person had walked away. In some way I had not heard. I started to think they might have moved while I was holding my breath, and the small sounds of their leaving might have been covered by the small sound of my own pulse in my ears. I told myself they were gone. I made myself believe it, slowly, over a period of minutes. I did not turn over. I did not unzip the flap. I did not turn on my headlamp. I lay there, and I told myself I had imagined the silence, and that the silence meant the person had gone back up the slope, and I waited for the rain to come back and cover the rest of the night. The rain did not come back. The bench stayed silent. I did not sleep. I do not know what time the dawn came. The sky lightened slowly through the rainfly. I waited until I could see the inside of the tent clearly, and then I waited a little longer, and only then did I unzip the flap and look out. There was no one at the edge of the laurel. I want to be careful about that. I looked at the wet ground beyond the laurel for any sign of a footprint, any mark of where a person had stood. The leaves were wet and undisturbed where I could see them. I could not see all the way through the laurel to the slope beyond. The screen was thick. I did not push through it to look. I did not want to put myself in a position where I could see what was on the other side, without being able to retreat to the tent. Jordan was out of his tent by the time I had crawled out of mine. He was standing in the small open space between our tents, in his rain jacket, looking at the laurel. He turned when I came out. He looked at me. His face was the gray of a person who has not slept. He asked me, in a voice that was so steady it sounded false, if I had heard the whistling start up again around 4. I looked at him for a long moment. I told him I had not heard it. He looked at the laurel. He told me, slowly, that the whistling had started up again from the same spot at the edge of the bench at around 4 in the morning. He told me it had been the same 4 notes. He told me it had gone on without stopping, from 4 until the first gray of dawn. He told me he had lain awake the entire time. He told me he had not made a sound. I did not say anything. I had not heard it. I had been lying in my tent, 6 feet from him, listening with my eyes open, and I had not heard it. I do not know what that means. I have wondered, in the years since, whether I had fallen asleep without realizing it. and had slept through it. I have wondered whether the whistling, when it had started again, had not been audible from inside my tent, for reasons I cannot explain. I have wondered, most of all, whether the whistling had started again only for him. Whether the person at the edge of the laurel had stopped the first time because we had both fallen quiet and had started again only when Jordan had alone been awake to hear it, the way a person might whistle a tune for one specific listener. We packed up in silence that morning. We hiked the 4 miles back to the trailhead in silence. We got into our separate cars at the trailhead, and we said goodbye. And we drove our separate ways back to Cincinnati and Louisville. Jordan and I have not camped together since. We are still friends. We see each other twice a year, in Lexington at a restaurant on a Saturday afternoon. We have never talked about the whistling. He has never brought it up, and I have not brought it up. I think we are both afraid of the question that would come up if we did. Because I have wondered, every year for almost a decade now, what tune the whistler had been whistling for him alone in those 4 hours in the dark, and whether Jordan still hears the 4 notes, sometimes when he is alone in his apartment at night, and whether he has come, in the years since, to recognize the song. I had been doing solo trips into the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest for almost 15 years, by the time the night I am writing about happened. I lived in Roanoke, where I had moved after college, and never left. And the National Forest was, depending on the section, anywhere from 45 minutes to 4 hours from my apartment. I had favorite trails, and I had ones I went back to every few years, and I had a few sections I had been to only once, and had marked on my map for a return trip when I had the time. The trip I want to tell you about was a return trip to one of those sections. A small piece of the forest in the southern part of the system, off a forest road that ran for almost 12 miles before it ended at a turnaround, with a primitive trail that left the road maybe a mile before the end and went up a creek into the back country. I had walked that trail once, 4 years before, on a day hike. I had gone up the creek for about 2 hours and turned around and come back. I had remembered the country as quiet in a particular way, even for that part of the state. There had been no other cars at the pull-off when I had parked. The trail had been faint, the kind of trail that gets walked maybe twice a year, and is in danger of being reclaimed by the country it runs through. I had passed no other hikers in either direction. I had spent the 4 years since wanting to come back and spend a couple of nights up the creek, far enough up that I could pick a quiet camp and not see a soul for the duration of the trip. I had taken 3 days off in late September. The weather had been beautiful through the first half of the month, the clear, cool days that the Blue Ridge gets when the leaves are just starting to think about turning. The forecast for my weekend had been mixed. A system was coming in from the west and was supposed to bring rain on Friday afternoon and Saturday morning before clearing out for Sunday. I had decided I could work around it. I had driven down on Friday morning to get ahead of the rain, and I had reached the forest road by 11 and parked at the pull-off by noon. The pull-off was empty. The trailhead sign was faded almost past reading. I shouldered my pack, and I walked up the trail along the creek into the woods. The country was, as I had remembered it. The trail was faint. The creek ran loud over its rocks. The hemlocks crowded close on both sides of the path, and the light through them was the green-gray light of an old forest under a heavy canopy. I walked for about 3 hours up the creek. I went further than I had gone on my day hike 4 years before. The trail thinned out as I climbed, and by the time I had been walking for the better part of the afternoon, I had reached a section where the trail was no more than a deer path, a faint line in the leaf litter that I followed by intuition more than by sight. I was looking for a flat spot to camp before the rain came in. The country was steep on both sides of the creek, and flat ground was hard to find. I came around a bend in the creek in the middle of the afternoon, and I saw, on the inside of the bend, a small clearing. It was the kind of clearing that happens by accident in old forest. A patch of flat ground where a few trees had come down years ago, and a small open space had opened up under the canopy. The ground was covered in soft moss and old needles. There was no fire ring, no sign that anyone had ever camped there before. The creek ran along the edge of the clearing. The clearing was screened on all sides by hemlocks. It was about the size of a small bedroom. I set up my tent at the back of it, against the slope that rose up from the creek, and I rigged a small tarp, off a branch above, where I planned to put my fire ring. I built a small ring of stones from the creek bed. The rain came in around 4. It started as the kind of light, scattered rain that I might have ignored if I had still been walking, and it built up over the course of an hour into the steady, soft rain that the southern Appalachians get when a system has decided to take its time. I had everything under the tarp by the time the rain had become serious. I got a fire going under the tarp, and I cooked an early supper as the light began to fail. The fire was small, but it was steady. The wood I had gathered was wet on the outside and dry on the inside, the way fallen wood in an old forest can be if you pick it right, and once I had it going, it burned well. The light went down fast that day under the cloud cover. By 6:30, it was almost full dark. The fire under the tarp was the only light in the clearing. I sat on my pack against a tree with a mug of tea, and I listened to the rain on the tarp and on the leaves of the hemlocks above. And I felt the good feeling that comes at the end of a hard hike when you are warm and dry and alone in good country. The laughter started just after dusk. I do not remember the exact moment. I remember that I had been staring into the fire for a while, the way you do, and that the sound came in slowly enough that I had been hearing it for several seconds before I realized I was hearing it. It was the sound of children. I want to be precise about that. It was not the sound of one child. It was the sound of several children. There were at least 4 of them, I thought, maybe more, and they were laughing, the way children laugh when they are playing together in a yard, the kind of high, happy laughter that has running in it, that has calling out in it, that has the easy pleasure children have when they are absorbed in some game with their friends. The sound was coming from somewhere up the slope behind my tent. Not very far, I thought. Maybe 60 or 70 yards up through the wet hemlocks. I could not see anything through the trees. The trees were too thick, and the dusk was too far gone. But the sound was clear. I could hear the children running through what sounded like wet leaves, the small, soft thump of small feet on the duff. I could hear them calling to each other in voices that were the voices of children, the higher pitch, the breathlessness of laughter mixed in. I could not make out any of the words. The voices were not far enough away that I should not have been able to make out words, but the words did not come through. The voices stayed at the level of pure sound, the way the voices of strangers in a crowd do, where you can hear that someone is talking, but you cannot hear what they are saying. I sat very still under my tarp. I do not know how long it took me to fully understand what I was hearing. Maybe a minute, maybe 2. The understanding came in slowly. There were no roads near where I was camped. There were no houses. There was no campground. I had checked the map carefully before I had picked my route, the way I always do. The nearest road of any kind, including the forest road I had parked on, was more than 5 miles from my clearing as the crow flies. The nearest paved road was 12. The nearest house, the nearest anything that could have explained a group of children playing in a yard was many miles farther than that. There was no possible source for the sound I was hearing. There were no children within walking distance of where I was sitting. There were not supposed to be any children anywhere within hearing distance. And the sound was clearly the sound of children playing. I called out. I did it without thinking. I cupped my hands around my mouth, and I called hello up the slope, the way you call hello in the woods, when you are not sure if the person on the other end is going to hear you, and you want to give them every chance. I called out twice. I asked if everyone was okay. I asked if they needed help. The children did not respond. The laughter did not pause. It did not change in any way I could hear. The voices did not stop their calling. The running did not slow. The children, whoever they were, kept playing, and they kept playing exactly as they had been playing before I had called out. They did not respond to my voice. They did not seem to have heard it. They did not seem to care that I had called. I want to describe what I felt then, because I have felt it only once or twice in my life, and I do not have a good name for it. It was not the sharp fear that comes when you hear a stranger move close to your tent in the night. It was not the cold that comes when you understand that something is wrong. It was a slower, deeper feeling. It was the feeling of being in a place where the rules I had relied on all my life had stopped applying, and where the world was doing something that the world was not supposed to do, and where the only thing I could do about it was sit very still and listen. The laughter moved. I noticed it gradually. The voices had been somewhere up the slope, in a relatively fixed position. After a while, I realized that they were not in the same place anymore. They had moved. They were now off to the right of where they had been, somewhere through the trees on the far side of the slope. Then they moved back. Then they moved farther to the left. The children, whoever they were running. They were running through the wet woods. The way children run when they are playing tag in a yard, the laughter bursting out in different places, the calling out, coming from one position and then from another. The sound of their movement was real. The soft thumps of small feet on wet leaves were there. The breathlessness in the laughter was there. They were a group of children, running and playing through the hemlocks above my camp. The laughter came closer at some point. Not by very much. The closest it got was a distance I estimated at maybe 40 yards from where I was sitting. I never saw any of them. The trees were too thick and the light was gone, and even if I had been able to see, I do not know that I would have wanted to. I never saw a small figure between the trunks. I never saw a flash of light-colored clothing in the dark. The children were sound only. They were never sight. The sound went on for almost 3 hours. I sat under my tarp the entire time. I did not put out my fire. I had a strong feeling, which I have not been able to explain in the years since, that the fire was important. That as long as the fire was burning, I was somewhere the children were not going to come, and that if I let the fire die down, they would come closer, or they would come for me, or they would change in some way I did not want to see. I do not know if the feeling was accurate. I do not know that the fire was actually doing anything, but I kept it going. I added small pieces of wood to it carefully and as quietly as I could, the way you tend a fire when you do not want to make noise. The children played in the wet woods around my camp for those 3 hours. They never called a word I could understand. They never came into view. The laughter rose and fell and moved and came back. There were moments when I would have sworn I could hear individual voices, the higher pitch of what sounded like a girl the slightly deeper pitch of what sounded like a boy. There were moments when the running seemed to go in patterns, the way children's running goes in patterns, when they are playing a game with rules. There were moments when one of them would laugh particularly hard at something, the way a child does when something is unexpectedly funny, and the others would laugh in response. The voices were warm. The voices were happy. The voices were the voices of children having a good time. I sat under my tarp with my back against the tree, and my hands flat on my knees, and I listened. At some point, the laughter stopped. I do not know exactly when. There was no transition. The children were playing, and then they were not. The voices did not fade out. They did not move away into the distance. The running did not stop being audible because the children had run far enough through the woods to be out of earshot. The whole sound just ended. The forest went silent, and it stayed silent. The rain kept falling on the tarp above my head. The creek kept running along the edge of the clearing. There were no other sounds. The night had become the kind of night the woods become when there is nothing else in them. I did not put out my fire. I sat against the tree for the rest of the night. I kept the fire small. I added wood as I needed to. I did not lie down. I did not crawl into my tent. I had decided in some part of my mind that did not need to talk to itself to know what it knew, that I was going to stay where the light was, against the tree, with my eyes open until the sun came up. I do not know if anything would have happened if I had gone into the tent. I do not know if the laughter would have started again. I did not test it. I sat against the tree, and I waited for morning. The light came in slowly. The gray of dawn lifted the clearing into shape around me. The fire had burned down to coals. I let it die fully, and I rolled my pack, and I packed my tent wet, and I walked out of the clearing back down the trail to the forest road, as fast as I could walk on the wet ground. I made it back to my car in less than 2 hours. I did not stop to rest. I drove out of the forest road and onto the paved road, and I did not stop driving until I was almost home in Roanoke. I have not gone back to that section of the forest. I have not gone back to anywhere near it. I have done other solo trips since, in other parts of the national forest. In country I have known longer, but never in country where I could be reached only by walking many miles up a small creek away from any road. I think about the laughter sometimes. I think about how warm it was. I think about how the children sounded happy, and how they sounded like they were having a good time, and how they did not seem to be in any kind of distress, and how, in spite of all of that, the sound had been the most terrifying thing I have ever heard, because the sound had been impossible. And the children, if they were children, had been doing something other than playing, and what they had been doing had been close enough to playing, that they had been able to make the sound of it. And I have wondered, every year since, what would have made a group of children sound that happy in the rain, in the dark, in country where no living child had any reason to be. My husband Daniel and I had been married for 7 years that fall, and we had taken to celebrating our anniversary with a small camping trip somewhere we had not been before. We were both in our middle 30s, both working long weeks at jobs that did not leave us much time together, and the small camping trips had become something we needed more than we wanted to admit. We had spent the past 2 anniversaries at the same state park in Southwest Virginia, in the kind of country that had begun to feel like our country, the rolling Blue Ridge foothills, with their small creeks and their old hardwoods, and the particular quality of light that the southern Appalachians get in October when the leaves are at their peak. We had loved the park. The 3rd year we had decided to go back because we had loved it, and because going back to a place we had loved had begun to feel like the right way to mark the years. We drove out on a Friday afternoon in late October. The leaves were just past their peak. The rain that the forecast had warned us about had not yet come in. We checked in at the small ranger station at the entrance to the park, and the ranger, who had taken our payment, had been an older woman with a kind face who had remembered us from the previous year, or had said she had, and had told us the park was very quiet that weekend, that we would have most of the campground to ourselves. We had picked a walk-in site in a small loop on the far side of the park, a quiet loop with maybe a dozen sites set well apart in the trees, all of them requiring a short walk from the small parking area on a paved path through the woods. We had stayed in that loop the previous 2 years. We knew the loop. We knew which sites had the best views and which had the best privacy. And the ranger had told us when we had checked in that we were the only people booked in the loop for the weekend. We walked our packs in around 4. The sky was already darkening with the front. We set up our tent at our favorite site in the loop, a small flat clearing with a stone fire ring and a wooden picnic table, and enough trees around it to feel like a small room in the woods. The site was set off the paved path by another short footpath through the trees, the kind of footpath that gave you the feeling of being further from the road than you actually were. We pitched the tent. We set up our small camp kitchen on the picnic table. The first rain started around 5, gentle at first, building slowly through the early evening. By the time we had eaten supper and were sitting on the bench of the picnic table under the small tarp we had rigged off the corner of the tent, the rain had settled in for the night. We spent the evening reading by lantern light. Daniel had brought a paperback. I had brought a book about the history of the region we were in, the kind of book I had picked up specifically for the trip, because I had wanted to know more about the country we kept coming back to. The lantern was a propane lantern, one of the small ones that throws a steady warm light, and we sat across the picnic table from each other, reading in the small glow of it under the tarp while the rain came down on the canvas above us. I remember it well. I have remembered it carefully. It was a quiet anniversary evening, the kind of evening we had been needing. Around 10, we banked the lantern down and we put the books away. We brushed our teeth at the spigot at the head of the path. We crawled into the tent and we got into our shared sleeping bag, and we lay close together in the dark with the rain on the rainfly, and we talked the way you talk in a tent at night. When you have been married 7 years, the small, soft conversation of people who have a lot of practice falling asleep next to each other. Daniel was asleep before I was. I lay awake listening to his breathing for a while and to the rain, and at some point I went under. I do not know what time I woke. I came up out of sleep with the kind of awareness that something was wrong before I knew what it was. It is a feeling I have only had a few times in my life. The body comes alert. The breath shortens. The mind has not yet had time to think a thought, but the body has already understood something that the mind has not gotten to. I lay very still in the bag. Daniel was breathing slowly beside me. The rain was still falling on the fly. The light through the canvas was the pale gray of first light, the very first gray before dawn, when the sun is not yet up, but the dark has begun to lift. I do not know why I unzipped the flap. The feeling told me to. I sat up slowly in the bag, and I worked the zipper of the inner door open one tooth at a time, and I leaned forward and I looked out into the site. There was a second tent set up in our site. I want to describe what I saw because I have lived with it for a long time now, and the details have stayed in my mind in a way I have not been able to wear down. The second tent was a small one-person tent. It was the kind of tent that has a small ridge pole and one intersection just big enough for a sleeping bag. It was a pale color, a faded shade of yellow or pale gold, the color a tent goes when it has been left out in the sun for too many seasons. The fabric looked old. It looked like a tent from 20 or 30 years ago, the kind of tent that had been popular when I was a child, before the modern dome designs became standard. It was pitched cleanly. The lines were taut. The rain was running off it in a steady sheet, the way water runs off a tent that has been pitched well by someone who had done it many times. The tent was about 6 feet from our own. That is the distance I have been most careful to remember. 6 feet, maybe a little more. Not far. Close enough that I could have reached out from where I was sitting in the door of our tent and almost touched the rain fly of the second tent. It had been set up to my left, in the small open space between our tent and the picnic table, in the only flat patch of ground in the site, other than the patch where our own tent stood. Whoever had pitched it had picked the best available spot for a tent in the site that was not already occupied. The tent had not been there when we had gone to bed. I want to be clear about that. We had been the only people in the site. Daniel and I had walked around the small clearing before we had crawled into our tent for the night. We had banked the lantern and taken it to the picnic table and walked the small loop of the site one last time before we had zipped up the flap. The site had been empty. There had been no other tent, no other gear, no sign that any other person had been in the loop with us. The ranger had told us we were the only ones in the loop that weekend. We had heard no voices and no footsteps. We had heard nothing all evening except the rain and our own quiet conversation under the tarp. The site had been empty when we had gone to bed. And now there was a tent in it. I looked at the ground around the second tent. The ground in our site was the soft leaf-covered ground of an old hardwood forest, with the leaves wet from the rain and the underlying soil soft from the moisture. It was the kind of ground that takes prints clearly. Our own footprints were visible from where I was sitting, the small trails of muddy depressions where Daniel and I had walked to and from the picnic table and the spigot. The prints were partially filled with rainwater, but they were still clearly visible. The whole site was a record of our movements through the evening. There were no footprints around the second tent. I looked very carefully. I leaned forward in the door of our tent, and I looked at the ground, all around the small pale tent, on every side that I could see. There were no prints leading to it. There were no prints leading away from it. There were no prints around it, where the person who had pitched it would have walked while setting it up. The leaves around the second tent were wet, but they were undisturbed. The leaves immediately around the tent had not been pushed aside or trampled. The mud at the base of the rainfly had not been pressed by any boot or shoe. The tent had been pitched on ground that no one had walked across. The flap of the second tent was zipped shut. I sat in the door of our tent, and I looked at the zipped flap, and I did not move. I do not know how long I sat there. The rain kept falling. The pale gray of the dawn light grew slowly stronger. The second tent did not move. The flap stayed closed. There was no sound from inside it. There was no shifting of weight. There was no breathing I could hear over the soft drip of the rain. The tent was set up neatly 6 feet from my face, in a site that had been empty hours before, and no one had walked to it, and no one had walked from it, and whatever was inside it was either lying very still or was not there. I do not know how long I sat looking at the second tent. I do not know if it was minutes or longer. I know that I did not call out. I did not say hello. I did not ask whoever might be inside it if they were all right or if they needed anything. I had understood Somewhere in the time I had been sitting there, that calling out was not the right thing to do. That, whatever the explanation was for the tent being there, the explanation was not the explanation of another camper. Having walked in quietly during the night and pitched their tent next to ours. The lack of footprints was the thing my mind kept returning to. There was no way to pitch a tent on soft ground in the rain without leaving a single track. There was no way to bring a tent to a site without walking it in. There was no possible mundane account of what I was looking at. I crawled back from the door of the tent. I touched Daniel's shoulder. I shook him as gently as I could. He woke up slowly, the way he wakes up, with the small grunt of a man being pulled out of a deep sleep. I put my finger against my lips. He looked at me. He saw whatever was on my face. He went still. I leaned close to him, and I whispered to him that there was another tent in our sight. I whispered it, very quietly. I whispered to him not to make any noise. I whispered to him that we needed to leave. He looked at me for a long second. Then he sat up. He looked out the door of the tent. I watched his face as he saw the second tent. He did not say anything. His face went the same gray that I had felt my own face going. The gray of a person whose mind has caught up to what their eyes are telling them. He looked at the ground around the small pale tent. I saw him notice the same thing I had noticed. He looked back at me. He nodded once. We packed in 15 minutes. We did not speak. We rolled the tent down with our sleeping bags still inside it because we did not want to take the time to separate them. We jammed everything into our packs in whatever order it would fit. We picked up the camp stove and the lantern from the picnic table. We did not look at the second tent any more than we had to look at it to walk past it. We did not check it before we left. We did not consider going to look at it, or knocking on the flap, or unzipping it to see what was inside, or doing any of the things a person might consider doing if they encountered a strange tent in their campsite under ordinary circumstances. We had both, separately, in the time between his waking up and our finishing packing, come to the same understanding about what we were looking at. We did not need to discuss it. We walked the short footpath back to the paved path. We walked the paved path back to the parking area. The pale tent was visible from the footpath for the first part of the walk, and then it was hidden by the trees. And then we did not look back. We put our packs in the back of the car, and we got in, and we drove out of the loop and out of the park. We did not stop at the ranger station on the way out. We had paid for 2 nights. We let the second night go. We did not speak for the first hour of the drive home. We did not turn on the radio. We did not look at each other. Daniel drove, and I sat in the passenger seat, and we both watched the road. About an hour into the drive, somewhere on the small 2-lane that runs through the country between the park and the interstate, Daniel pulled the car over at a small church that had a gravel parking lot. He turned off the engine. He sat with his hands on the wheel for a long moment. Then he turned to me. He told me he did not want to look up the park online when we got home. He told me he did not want to read the park's news. He told me he did not want to look for any record of any camper found at our site, or any tent reported as found by the rangers, or any missing person notice that might have come out in the days afterward. He told me he wanted us to agree, the 2 of us in that gravel parking lot, that we were not going to try to find out anything more about what we had seen. He told me he had been thinking about it the whole drive, and he had decided that he would rather not know than know. I told him I agreed. We have not looked it up. We have been married 9 more years now. We have gone on other camping trips, but never back to that park, and never to anywhere within 50 miles of it. We have not, in the years since, allowed ourselves to look up the park's news, or the campsite, or any record of any unusual occurrence in Southwest Virginia on the weekend of our anniversary that year. I have come close, more than once, to typing the search into a browser. Each time I have stopped. Each time I have thought about Daniel's face in the gravel parking lot, and I have thought about the tent in the site, and I have thought about the lack of footprints, and I have decided that the not knowing is the only thing that has let me sleep on the nights I have been able to sleep at all. I do not know who, if anyone, was inside the pale tent. I do not know whether the rangers ever found it. I do not know whether it was still there when the next campers arrived in the loop, or whether it had vanished by the time the sun was fully up, or whether it had been waiting there for someone other than us. I have wondered, in the way you wonder things you cannot prove, whether the tent had been pitched as a kind of invitation, set up next to our own, as if to ask whether we wanted to know what was inside, and whether the only correct answer had been the one we gave, which was to walk away without looking, and to keep walking away in our minds for the rest of our lives.